Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. Today, our group will present about our paper on the US-China tariff war from the perspective of international political economy or IPE. In today's world, countries use not only military power but also economic tools such as tariff, sanction, and trade restriction to protect their interests and increase their influence. One of the most significant examples is the US-China trade war, which began in 2018 and intensified in 2025. While it started as a trade dispute, it later developed into a broader competition involving technology, economic security, and global influence. The conflict has affected global trade, investment, and supply chain, with significant impact on developing countries, especially in Southeast Asia. Therefore, this paper analyzed the US-China tariff war using a 4 IPE perspective, which is realism, liberalism, structuralism, and mercantilism, to better understand its causes, consequences, and wider implications.
Good morning everyone. The US-China trade war began in 2018 when the United States imposed tariff on Chinese import, leading China to respond with its own tariff. The conflict was driven by issues such as trade imbalance, technology transfer, and market access. However, this trade war is not only about economics, it also reflects a broader geopolitical rivalry between the world's two largest economies. The conflict has disrupted global supply chains and created uncertainty in international trade. From an international political economy perspective, tariffs are used as strategic tools to protect national interests and strengthen a country's position in the global system. Therefore, the US-China trade war can be seen as a competition for both economic power and global influence.
Next, we move to the literature review part. First, many scholars argue that the tariff war is not just about trade. It is also a foreign policy tool used by the United States to limit China's economic and technological rise, especially in the strategic sectors such as artificial intelligence and semiconductors. Second, from a liberal perspective, the trade war highlights the weaknesses of the international trading system. The World Trade Organization, or WTO, has been unable to effectively resolve disputes between the two countries, leading the United States to rely on unilateral tariff measures. Third, domestic political factors also play an important role. In the United States, job losses in the manufacturing sector increase support for protectionist policies such as tariff. In China, US tariffs are often viewed as an attempt to contain China's rise, which has strengthened public support for the government. To conclude this part, most studies agree that the US-China tariff war is no longer just an economic dispute. It has become a strategic tool used by both countries to protect their national interests and shape the global balance of power.
For a theoretical approach, we use international political economy to understand why the US and China use economic policy as a tool of international politics. The trade war is not only a normal trade dispute, but also involves power, security, and competition for global influence. Therefore, we analyze it through three perspectives, which is realism, liberalism, and structuralism. From the realist perspective, states compete to protect their national interests and increase their power. The US-China trade war can be seen as a competition between an existing hegemon, the United States, and a rising power of China. The US sees Chinese technology growth, especially in areas like semiconductor and advanced technology, as a challenge to its global dominance. Therefore, tariffs are used as an economic weapon instead of military force. Liberalism argued that economic interdependence encourages cooperation because countries benefit from trade. The US and China are highly connected through global supply chains. However, the trade war showed the limitation of liberal idea because despite economic dependence, both countries still choose tariff and restrictions. This also shows that institutions like the WTO are not always effective in solving conflict. From the realist perspective, states compete to protect their national interests and increase their power. The US-China trade war can be seen as a competition between an existing hegemon, the United States, and a rising power of China. The US sees Chinese technology growth, especially in areas like semiconductor and advanced technology, as a challenge to its global dominance. Therefore, tariffs are used as an economic weapon instead of military force.
So I will explain about the analysis and discussion for this topic. The best perspective of the international political economy to use in discussing this topic of trade wars between the United States and China is through the perspective of mercantilism and neo-mercantilism. So mercantilism suggests that a country should accumulate wealth and manipulate the economy and trade policy to maximize their revenue in order to secure their territories, just as what the US and China has been doing. So by manipulating the country's trade policy, the government of the country aims to maximize the income and to secure power in the international stage of politics. So moving to the next slide, we can see here the chart of the trade wars tariff between the US and China. So in early 2025, the trade problems become worse. So the tariff between the US and China has increased from around 20% to up to 150%. So this trade wars began when the US put a new taxes on the goods from China. This is including Canada and Mexico. So on February 4, 2025, the US also stopped letting ship packages to enter the country without paying taxes. So this means that even a small package would need to pay duty to the US government. And then the US also, they raised its tax on Chinese goods from 10% to 20%. Then because of this, China immediately fought back by placing taxes on US farm products like meat, and they start the investigation against US business. This is causing that the exporters from America too hard to enter to Chinese market. So on the next slide, we can see the Chinese tariff on US exports in 2025. As we can see here, the tariff immediately jumped high from 20% to up to 150%. So the US made all Chinese packages pay taxes, and they add more baseline tariff. The China, they responded by stopping many American tech and defense companies from selling goods to China. So by the end of April, both countries added another 50% tariff and making the total tax rate of 84% for both sides. So in early May 2025, the tariff hits the highest points, which is 127.2% for the US tariff and 147.6% for the Chinese tariff. And luckily, on 12 May, both sides met in Geneva and they agreed to drop these extra taxes to 10% for 90 days. And while they talked, the US later extended this break until November. And finally, in November 2025, both countries agreed to sign an official agreement where the US lowered its tariff from 20% to 10%, and in return, China agreed to buy American soybeans and stop its extra taxes and allow import minerals to be exported again. So moving on to the next slide, which is the analysis on the political factors which cause these trade wars. So through a mercantilist view, the US and China see the global economy as a zero-sum game where one country's gain is another country's loss. So they use their trade policies as a weapon to protect themselves instead of working together. So the trade wars highly affected by the leaders of a country. So according to the data, so we can see that the biggest tariff jumps happened during Donald Trump's administration, specifically in 2018 and in 2025. So a major political goals for the US is to remain their position as the world top superpowers. However, because of China's economy that grew very fast in the late 20th century, the US felt threatened by the China rising power, and they responded with high tariff to China. However, China also shows that the capability to fight back towards the US economically. So the next slide shows the analysis on the economic factors through the mercantilist and neo-mercantilist perspective. So the first one, both countries want to protect their own home industry from foreign competition. For example, the US used the protectionist policies because the Chinese goods while flooding the American market. And then the second one, the US view the huge trade deficit with China as a danger and threaten its domestic wealth and economic independence. So the third one, the Trump administration removed the de minimis tax exemption in early 2025 in order to stop cheap Chinese goods and force international companies to move their factories out of China. Fourth, in response, China respond with its own mercantile strategies to protect the industry. They put a heavy taxes on US agriculture product, and they also created strict export rules on rare earth minerals that the US really needs. And in 2025, China also used its trade policy to hurt American technology and defense company in order to protect their own national security and tax interests. We will discuss the impact of the trade wars toward the developing countries in Southeast Asia. So the structuralist theories explain that smaller countries in Southeast Asia are deeply connected to the global trade networks controlled by the big superpowers like the US and China. And because of this, they are easily hurt by any changes in the international trade systems. And to avoid high US tariff on Chinese goods, many international businesses have shifted their investment and moved factories out of China. And they're using the China Plus One strategy, which is to keeping some operation in China, but also opening new factories in Southeast Asia countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand. Moreover, this shift is a positive side for some Southeast Asia countries, because it gives the manufacturing industry a great chance to grow and allows them to sell more goods to the US market. And despite exporting more to the US, these developing nations still depend heavily on China for factory parts, machinery, and raw materials. Moreover, this situation also has caused Southeast Asian nations to face growing trade deficits with China, while the trade surplus with the US increase. This imbalance creates unstable supply chains and leaves these smaller nations at risk from global economic shift. And in the end, the trade wars bring both advantage and disadvantage to Southeast Asia, proving that the economic success or failure of these smaller nations remains trapped in the middle of struggle between bigger and developed countries.
Now, let's see about the conclusion. In conclusion, the US-China tariff war shows how economic tools can be used to achieve political and strategic goals. What started as a trade dispute gradually became a broader competition involving technology, national security, and global influence. The conflict can be explained through different international political economy theories. Realism explains the power competition between the two countries. Liberalism highlights the limit of economic operation. Structuralism focuses on inequalities in the global economy, while mercantilism emphasizes the use of economic policy to strengthen national power. Both the United States and China use tariff and other trade measures to protect their national interests. The effects of the conflict were felt not only by these two countries, but also by the global economy, especially in Southeast Asia. Overall, the trade war highlights the growing importance of geoeconomics and demonstrate that politics and economics are closely interconnected in today's international system.